Hello and welcome to Property Matters here on Dublin South FM. You can contact the show on Twitter, Facebook or LinkedIn at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Your host for today is myself, Carol Tallon, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ronan Lyons, Assistant Professor at Trinity College Dublin and author of the latest Daft rental report. Ronan, today's a busy day for you, so thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Carol.
Ronan, the latest Daft rental report, you might just talk us through some of the headline figures. I mean, look, the one that jumped out to me was certainly about stock levels, but you might just take us through some of the key findings.
Absolutely, yeah. So the report looks at the last 12 months. So it looks mostly at the COVID era of the rental market, and it covers the whole country. And there's kind of two separate stories. There's the Dublin story and there's the story in the rest of the country. In Dublin, rents have fallen by a little bit more than 3% over the last year. Whereas in the rest of the country, they're actually up by about 5.5%. And that 5.5%, yeah, there's a little variation, but pretty much anywhere you go outside Dublin, rents are up year on year. In Dublin, it doesn't matter where you go, really, rents are down. So you can look at all the different postcodes. And yeah, again, there's a bit of difference. Some places, Dublin city centre has fallen a bit more, South City has fallen a bit more, and then if you go to West Dublin, it's fallen a bit less. But by and large, it's down in Dublin and up elsewhere. And as you mentioned, this is a story really about supply. Prices are just what happens. Rent prices going up or down is just what happens when supply meets demand. And if there isn't a lot of supply there, you'll get rents going up. And if there's an improvement in the situation, rents will come down. And that's what's happened over the last year. The supply situation in Dublin has actually improved. More rental properties have come on the market, and that's eased a crunch in rents or a spike in rents, and whereas in the rest of the country, that hasn't been the same.
Ronan, you know, I'm always a fan of reading the reports that you author because you bring maybe a human element into the numbers, you know, and that really shares a deeper insight. So in terms of the supply, you know, is the increased supply in Dublin, we'll just take the Dublin market first before we look outside of Dublin. In the Dublin market, is the increased supply a real increase in terms of numbers, or is it just that there are fewer people taking up the stock that was there, so it's feeding into a larger supply?
Well, so, I mean, this is a great question. I was only tweeting about this earlier about an increase in supply. And so some people said, well, what if it's a fall off in demand, not an increase in supply? They'd give the same result. So I think the best way of looking at that is if you look at the number of ads that come on the market at any particular point in time. So on average, Dublin used to see about 2,100 rental ads per month in, say, if you go from, say, April 2019 to December 2019, so kind of pre-pandemic, Dublin was seeing about 2,100 rental homes coming on the market per month. That increased to 3,100 in the following period. So April 2020 to December 2020, the kind of the pandemic months. So there's a big increase in supply. All of those properties found a renter. So there's actually a big increase in demand as well. But the liquidity, the activity in the market improved, and that brought rents back down. And it's kind of helpful to think about, okay, how does Dublin look compared to the rest of the country there? Because in the rest of the country, COVID has had the opposite effect. So this is not like a foregone conclusion that COVID was always going to have this effect. In the rest of the country, the market has seized up even more, a bit like the sales market. In the sales market, there's anytime there's a level 5 or a lockdown, whatever you want to call it, the market seizes up. There aren't the same number of homes for sale, and that leads to a fall off in transactions. Whereas, as I say, the rental market outside Dublin is like that, but the rental market in Dublin has been different.
Okay, you know, I think it's really interesting when you talk about even the behavioural side of this, because at the start, like, you know, certainly 10 months ago, 11 months ago, we were thinking about what the likely impacts would be. And there were lots of predictions made. So many things have not gone as predicted. So in terms of not just the rental, but actually the marketplace in general, what has been your biggest surprise looking at the data now, you know, now that we're into Q1 of 2021, looking back at 2020, you know, what are some of the surprises?
I think if you'd sat someone like me down a year ago and said, there's going to be an extraordinary pandemic, it's going to last at least a year, everyday activity is going to be restricted so heavily. Bars are going to be closed for a year. Restaurants are going to be closed for most of it. Lots of shops are going to be closed. Unemployment is going to go up 20% or 25% of the workforce. Somebody like me, after recovering, would have said, well, it's obvious that rents and sale prices are going to fall. And they're going to fall by 10, 15, 20%. That's what you'd expect to happen when you get such a big increase in unemployment. And if you look back at 2008, 9, 10, that was the story of the rental market, and it was at least half the story in the sales market. In the sales market, there was also the credit market realigning, but a big chunk of the falls was to do with unemployment rising and incomes falling. We haven't seen that. We've seen sale prices go up over the last 12 months, and not just in Ireland. It's not like Ireland is some sort of freakish property market. If you look at Britain, if you look at many places in Europe, and indeed in the US as well, sale prices for property have gone up during COVID, and some of that might be to do with the unprecedented level of protections for incomes, or the oddly, I suppose, what's the bifurcated, or like what they call the K-shaped recovery, in that you've got some sectors that are not affected at all. You have people working in financial services or public services, and their incomes are the same and their expenditure is down, so there's more money, even as there are other people who've lost their jobs. But some of it as well, I think, is to do with potentially due. We don't have the evidence to say this definitively yet, but I think some of it is down to a change in preferences, both as consumers and as wealth holders, that people are looking at property as an investment where, well, actually, when everything else fails, we're still going to be stuck in our homes. So actually, we want to think long and hard about the kinds of homes we live in as renters or as buyers.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, because really, this reminds me of maybe when you and I first met over a decade ago, and we were talking about the fallout of the crash, and the same thing, trying to predict behaviors and trying to look at maybe where we saw leaders emerge through the sector that were likely to lead us into recovery. And it feels like an element of this where sometimes the behavior doesn't correspond with what we might expect in the marketplace. And that's why I think it's interesting to see where the price increases and decreases are happening, in terms of rental and everything, because there's been so much talk about potential remote working and things like that. And, we haven't yet seen evidence to back that up, even though anecdotally we're seeing it everywhere. So is there anything kind of in the stats that tells us actually, the rents increasing outside of Ireland? Let's just take kind of some of the cities. So Limerick Waterford saw the largest increases. That was arguably coming off the lowest base.
And that's part of it. Is I think you almost have to break Ireland down into three types of market. There are the Dublin markets, there are the other cities, and then there's the rest of the country. Yeah. And in the rest of the country, you have this phenomenon of COVID actually worsening the shortage, that the rental markets have seized up. There were only 5 properties to rent in Offaly last week, anywhere in the county. It's extraordinary, and that's what's pushed rents up. And then you could say some of it is people working more remotely. That's why there's so few. But we're not seeing the same volume of properties coming down in Offaly or in other places as we would have seen pre-COVID. So it doesn't really stack up. And as we've talked a good bit about Dublin, it's had the opposite effect. The other cities are somewhere in between. That the supply is up, like in Dublin, but rents are up, like in rural Ireland. So what we're seeing there, I think, is maybe the first signs that people are willing to think about what you'd call intercity swaps, that they did live in Dublin, but you know what, they're going to try Limerick or Galway or Waterford or Cork. And exactly as you said, because you get a city life, but it's significantly cheaper. The average rent in Dublin is about €2,000. The average rent in the other 4 cities, if you kind of lump them together, is about €1,300 or €1,400. So there's a good bit of savings there. And maybe we'll have to go back up to Dublin when everything's back to normal, but that's 6 months or 12 months away. So we can make that call closer to the time. And in the meantime, we'll save the money. It's not, though, I think, as you were saying in the question, we haven't seen yet this kind of politician's ideal of, everyone's going to go off to Achill or to the Blasket Islands, whatever, and people, it doesn't really matter where you work. I was reading an interview with someone who moved to Achill, And it was really telling, that they were saying in it, I can't wait to get back to a town or to a city and to have cafes and so on. So even the people who are embracing the kind of the remote living, in the true sense of the word, people are not just workers, they're also, as economists say, consumers or livers, maybe is a better way of saying it. There's lots of other aspects of our lives that we love being around other people for. And I don't think that's going to change because of COVID.
Ronan, don't burst my bubble. I am one of the people who drank the Kool-Aid. I'm definitely intending to head west. So don't burst my bubble completely. But
no, you'll find the bargains. If you're willing to do that, then it'll be cheaper, because it looks like at the moment there won't be floods of people doing it.
Yeah, but I suppose that brings itself to kind of a bigger question. We're looking at the rental prices, but at the moment, professional built rent hasn't really happened outside of Dublin and Cork. Is there an appetite, do you think, for investment that it would be needed in the other regional cities like Waterford, like Limerick, like Galway?
Well, and you can go even beyond that. You can think about Tullamore and Carrick and Shannon and Sligo and Kilkenny and Drogheda. And all these places need significant increases in market rental, in social rental. There are whole categories of housing we don't really have in this country, for younger and older. We've so many family homes, we don't know what to do with them. But it's all the other kinds of homes we're short. And you've touched on, I think, probably the key point for the housing system in Ireland in the 2020s, which is understanding how to get viability in places where currently they're so far from viability. Like if you take, as you're saying, build to rent, we've lots of plans for Dublin, about 30,000 units in Dublin on the way. That's what they say. And then maybe 2,000 or 3,000 in Cork, and nothing elsewhere. But of course, that's not the pattern of demand, but that's the pattern of viability, that you can't make the numbers work. No matter how good a financial wizard you are, if you go and try and put in an apartment block of 100 apartments in Sligo town, you'll have to charge rents of 1,100 a month for a 2-bed, and that's twice what the market's going to bear. So we need to, like, if I were the housing minister, I wouldn't be looking at this report and saying, well, that's it, job done, rents in Dublin down 3%, rental issues are solved. It's okay, it proves that supply will help. It proves that the more supply you have, the more rents will come down. But the challenge of viability is still there.
I actually had a conversation with somebody who works in one of the housing organisations, the non-profit housing organisations last week, and she is looking at a move within Dublin, and she just expressed her frustration to me. She said, here I am working for one of these organisations. I don't qualify for social housing, and I can't even afford to rent an apartment on my own, so I'm going back in my 30s to rent a room in somebody's house. Yeah. What have we gotten so wrong?
So the way I think about this is, like, the central bank rules on the sales side, they have the clever side effect, not accidental at all, of linking sale prices for housing to the real economy. So no matter how crazy things get, they won't get as crazy as they were 2004, 5, 6, 7, where you could have house prices had kind of gone up to 7 or 8 times household income. But no part of government has done the same for the construction cost side of things. So even if you get free land and even if you have zero profit, it's still very expensive labor and materials to put in new housing, whether it's for sale or for rent. So of course, the supply side only ever cares about that prices to costs bit. Somebody's controlling prices, but costs have been allowed to drift up. And some of that is maybe down to the sector itself. Some of it is maybe down to regulation, that the kind of well-intentioned regulations, if you don't have countervailing measures, if you make it zero energy efficiency, if you make everything fully accessible and 9-foot ceilings and balconies, all that kind of stuff, all that may add bit by bit to cost. And what you're actually doing is not making the standard of housing better. You're just pricing out lower income households.
There's two things that you've touched on there that I'd love to delve into just a little bit, if you have a few extra minutes, and that is one, do you accept that actually, in terms of the cost of building, that I think the industry figure is that almost half isn't around the cost of building. Almost half of that is land administration and local authority levies. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to give an all-in-one because the side costs will vary so much. Like if you're buying in the centre of Dublin, down in Grand Canal Dock or something, versus if you're buying a site out in Drogheda, it's going to be very different, and the construction costs stay the same pretty much. It might vary a little bit, but basically the construction costs stay the same. So it's hard to give all-in averages. But yeah, certainly what are typically called the soft costs and the land costs, they definitely add to the base of hard costs. But a lot of those soft costs, say the profit margin, government's VAT, they're percentages. So if you reduce the hard costs, you're reducing the soft costs as well. Okay. All the marketing fees will be a percentage of the costs that have been paid. So again, if you can get the core down, you actually have knock-on effects, which is not to say we shouldn't look at how we tax or look at how tax land or new development. It's not to say we should ignore issues like that. Of course, we should look at those things. But if we could do our damnedest and fix all those things, and we'd still be left with the issue of high construction costs.
Okay, but we know that the construction sector itself is driving a huge initiative at the moment towards digital build, and that's all with the aim of increasing output, driving efficiencies so as not to increase costs. We're seeing this move towards offsite construction and other methods of modern construction, and I understand this isn't your area, so I definitely don't want to throw this one at you, but I think it's really important for us to understand, because one of the source of frustration when we came out of the crash is that I felt just from a kind of an almost a non-expert view of it, was that the pace of the recovery after the crash seemed to surprise everybody. So there wasn't time taken, or the opportunity wasn't used to make improvements then that ought to have been made. So now, we have this unprecedented pandemic and impacts. And I'm just wondering, are we missing another opportunity to actually drive real change that could actually have an impact on, persistent issues like affordability?
Yeah, I mean, you're singing or preaching to the converted on that. I wrote a piece at the end of 2009, so this is kind of in the height of negative equity mortgage arrears and so on. And I was saying like this, we're entering a rental shortage in Dublin, and part of the problem is that nuance gets lost in politics. So it's possible for some parts of Ireland, for example, the Northwest, to be suffering from a glut of housing that's unused, and other parts of Ireland, in particular, say the Dublin rental market, to be suffering shortages. They're not perfect substitutes for each other. So both those things are possible at the same time. But it really took, I'd say, until 2014 or 2015 for the idea of shortages to be back on the agenda. And that's frustrating, because you can be banging a drum for, in that case, 5 years before, and I'm not the only one, there were others saying it as well, before you realize that the current drum I'm banging is around housing for the diverse ways in which we live at the moment. And this is something that's been kind of ignored. In the 2010s, it was like, let's just get the number of homes built up. And as far as politicians are concerned, when you build a 3-bed semi-D, that's the homes you want to build. Families are voters, and that's, if you can get 20,000 of those, you're done. But if you look at where our population is changing, we're adding so many 70, 80, 90 somethings to our population. We're adding 20 and 30 somethings, pre-family households to our population. And that is something that's going to happen over the next 2-3 decades. And we really need to get away from building kind of 90% of our homes being either one-offs or estate housing, to building everything from assisted living and independent living complexes for older households, downsizer apartments, urban core high-rise apartments, and then even the dreaded kind of student accommodation and co-living sector. Like if you've got 1 million single persons aged between 20 and 39, it's not inconceivable that the country would need 5,000 or 6,000 co-living units. And as sacrilege and heresy as it is to say in Ireland today, that's where we're going in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Are you surprised? I'm so delighted that you went on to the different classifications of living, because that was exactly the final topic that I wanted to discuss with you, because it feels like a decade ago, I'm not going to say you were single-handedly doing it, but you were definitely one of the voices championing this need for Irish people in Ireland to embrace apartment living beyond, as a, beyond as your first professional,
Yeah.
where you're living professionally, but that actually, and I would argue that apartment design has not improved enough over that decade to make it attractive for a lot of families. So and I know there's huge work being done in all the city centres actually to target this. But in terms of the categories that you touched on, how have we moved on a decade, and yet it feels like we have fewer housing types and fewer housing options, because the bottom rung of the ladder has been taken away completely. And look, the market abhors a void. So we know you take away the bottom rung of the ladder and we get, shared living and co-living. And by banning that, have we just almost taken away two rungs of the ladder? And I say this with an adult daughter at home.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, this goes through to things like people objecting to planning permissions. Of course, they have a right to object to planning permissions, but I think given the country is short so many homes, that anyone who's a serious objector should say, look, I don't think this is the right development here, so this is my counter proposal, right? Like, we're talking about a country that needs, and everyone has their own figures. My own calculations are, given where our population is likely to be in terms of size, location, and age by mid-century, we need something like 45 to 50,000 new homes a year of all types. And in principally non-family households. The majority of households already are one or two persons, and that's only going to increase as the years go on. How have we ended up where we are with things looking actually more kind of monotonous maybe than 10 or 15 years ago? I think part of it was that the base we had 15 years ago for building non-family homes was a fragile base. It was tax breaks. That was the only reason. And they were a great idea when they were in kind of urban renewal schemes. And then they kind of went into, let's get votes in constituency schemes. And that was just a terrible idea. I mean, we saw that in the fallout of the bubble. So for me, the number one priority, and it's kind of like going back to something we talked about earlier, but in a way that just confirms, hopefully, that it is all actually coming back to the same core questions. If I were Minister for Housing, the single most important thing for me to understand is why it is so expensive to build housing for one or two person households in Ireland compared to other countries. Is it the productivity in the sector? Is it the methods they use? Is it wage rates? Is it taxation? Is it how we sell and trade land? We need those answers, because we can't solve the problem until we've tackled those. As it is, the kind of business as usual cases will just keep going further and further away from town centres and city centres, building on greenfield sites, building more 3 and 4 bed semi-Ds, and effectively trapping people in those until they die. And that's not the way other countries do housing. And I don't think it's the way we should do housing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I mean, one of the topics that I'm so sorry that we have to wrap up now, because one of the topics that we didn't get onto, but you touched on, was about housing for, I think you mentioned housing for the elderly, whereas I would see it more as maybe not even step down accommodation, but certainly accommodation that for downsizers, but within their own communities.
Exactly.
Look, I suppose, in 60 seconds, is there a way to unlock spaces within community, underused spaces?
Okay. As briefly as I can, I think you've touched on a really key issue, which is we need some integration between health and housing from a policy-making point of view, so that we get, say, in particular, assisted living, but even independent living on the table, and that it's a zoning category, and that there are targets set per decade or per 3 or 4 year period, whatever it might be, because that's going to be key. But even aside from the sort of integrated healthcare stuff, as you say, downsizers will happily downsize when it's in their area. You talked about, will we live in apartments? And the funny thing is, where they've been built, apartment blocks in, say, Terranure or Blackrock or Castleknock, they're disproportionately lived in by over 55s. So we have absolutely no problem living in them. We just don't have enough of them.
Okay, no, it's an interesting one, Ronan. I would love to chat to you for so many more hours about this, but we'll have to leave that for another day. That was Ronan Lyons, professor, assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, and author of the Daft Rental Report. We need to take a quick break now. Stay tuned.